On March 17, 1943, inside the U-boat command center in Caroli, France, a faint rasp of chalk echoed through the room as Captain Lieutenant Gaw Hessler updated the running totals on the strategy board. His hand paused more than once. The figures he was writing contradicted everything German naval intelligence had believed possible only a short time earlier. Facing Admiral Karl Dönitz and a line of senior officers, Hessler added a number that would have been dismissed as wild Allied exaggeration the previous winter. The Americans, according to multiple confirmed reports, had launched 17 merchant vessels in a single day. Through the haze of cigarette smoke drifting above the long operations table overlooking the Lorient submarine pens, Dönitz stared at the shifting arithmetic that now threatened the very basis of Germany's naval strategy. Evidence from clandestine observers in U.S. harbors, decoded radio exchanges, and interrogations of captured merchant crews all converged on one conclusion that seemed, at first glance, absurd. The United States was producing ships at a rate far beyond what German submarines could destroy. Not slightly faster, overwhelmingly faster. Dönitz, the architect of the tonnage war and the commander of Germany's submarine arm, was watching the balance of naval warfare through the cold lens of industrial output. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards, 18 of them, would turn out 2,710 Liberty ships, averaging 3 vessels every 48 hours. What Dönitz could not yet see clearly that morning was that Liberty ships represented only one portion of a much broader industrial surge. By the war's end, the United States would produce over 5,000 ships of various types, completely altering the strategic landscape of the Battle of the Atlantic. The realization forming in that operations room would spread through the U-boat service like the shockwave from a depth charge. For years, U-boat sailors had believed the war could be won through a deceptively simple equation: sink enemy shipping faster than it could be replaced. This idea had been central to Dönitz's 1939 proposal to Hitler. His calculation was straightforward. With a fleet of roughly 300 Type 7 U-boats, he estimated that Germany could destroy 1 million tons of shipping each month. Within a year, Germany would eliminate a significant portion of Britain's 3,000-ship merchant fleet, delivering an economic strangulation from which the island nation could not recover.
Britain required approximately 47 million tons of imported goods every year simply to endure. To break the British economy, the U-boat force needed to destroy 300,000 gross registered tons monthly, a threshold that would outstrip Britain's shipyard capacity. Dönitz summarized this logic in his meticulous war diary. Enemy shipping operates as one vast reservoir. Regardless of where a vessel goes down, its loss must eventually be compensated by another being built. It was strategy reduced to subtraction. Total ships minus losses equals survival or collapse. By early 1942, the formula seemed to be unfolding exactly as predicted. During the period U-boat crews later referred to as the Second Happy Time, German submarines operating off the American coastline from January through August sent 609 ships to the bottom, totaling more than 3.1 million tons. Korvettenkapitän Reinhard Hartigen, commanding U-123 near New York, noted in his diary, "One regrets there are not 10 boats here instead of 1. The hunting is superb." The Americans remain astonishingly unprepared after 2 years of conflict. Oberleutnant Herbert Werner of U-230 later described the almost hypnotic confidence that pervaded the fleet during those months. Crews ran the numbers incessantly. An average freighter was around 5,000 tons. 6 ships meant 30,000 tons. A single flotilla of 12 submarines, each sinking 6 ships per patrol, amounted to 360,000 tons lost to the enemy. With 40 boats deployed continuously, the math seemed to promise an inevitable victory. What none of them yet understood was that the Allied response would be driven not by incremental adjustments, but by an industrial revolution capable of rewriting the very rules of maritime warfare. The earliest hints that an unprecedented shift was occurring in American wartime ship production did not come from Allied sources, but from the most unlikely place: the survivors of ships sunk by German submarines. In the autumn of 1942, crew members rescued from the freighter West Lashway, torpedoed and later questioned aboard U-66, spoke openly and without hesitation about where their ship had been built. One of them, an oiler from Baltimore, remarked offhandedly that the vessel had rolled off the ways in just 35 days.
The captain of U-66, Korvettenkapitän Friedrich Markford, recorded in his war diary that such a claim could not possibly be accurate. For a 7,000-ton merchantman, he noted, German yards required at minimum half a year. To him, the prisoner was either confused or deliberately exaggerating. And yet, similar statements from other captured sailors kept emerging. When the Liberty ship William Clark was sunk by U-29 2 months later, her surviving crew reported that their ship had been only one of dozens under construction simultaneously in a single facility in Richmond, California. The second mate asserted, apparently with complete seriousness, that he had personally watched 3 Liberty ships take to the water in a single week. To officers at U-Boat Command, these claims sounded like crude psychological tactics instructed by Allied intelligence to rattle German crews. A senior operations officer, the son-in-law of Admiral Dönitz, wrote in an internal assessment that such production levels were technically unimaginable and therefore must be fabrications. What German analysts assumed to be Allied bluffing, however, turned out to be far less dramatic than the truth. In California, Henry Kaiser's Richmond shipyards were redefining the shipbuilding process. Their methods, built around large-scale prefabrication, rapid assembly, and a labor force trained in weeks, shattered every traditional expectation. The extraordinary launch of the SS Robert E. Peary on 12 November 1942 became emblematic of this revolution. The ship was completed 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after the keel had been laid. It was not conceived as a publicity stunt. It was meant to demonstrate a new industrial philosophy. Sections that had historically been created in place, stern assemblies, bow modules, internal framing, deck structures, even the double bottoms, were instead built as independent units and hoisted into position like pieces of an enormous steel model. Nearly 50 miles of welding replaced the slower, craft-dependent process of riveting. Because welding techniques were simpler to teach, the workforce expanded to include women, young trainees, and men with no prior industrial experience. What had once required a tight cadre of master shipfitters could now be accomplished by thousands of quickly trained workers. German intelligence eventually obtained American newspapers through agents operating in Portugal. The photographs they carried back to Berlin stunned naval planners. In these images, dozens of hulls stood at different points along the assembly line, cranes towered over the yards, and prefabricated sections the size of small buildings swung through the air on massive cables. One could see keels being laid, engines lowered into mid-construction hulls, and completed ships already steaming from the fitting outberths, all within the same panoramic frame.
U-boat commander Oberleutnant Peter Krimmer of U-333 later wrote that when he and others studied those photos, the realization set in that Germany was no longer confronting a conventional maritime opponent. They were not constructing ships, he observed. They were manufacturing them the way Americans build cars. By the beginning of 1943, the full scale of U.S. ship production was becoming undeniable. Monthly output figures that had once been dismissed as Allied disinformation were now corroborated by multiple intelligence channels. In January, American yards launched 96 ships, totaling 850,000 tons. In February, the number rose to 108 ships and 975,000 tons. March set another record with 120 ships, surpassing 1.1 million tons. Although the average completion time for a Liberty ship in 1944 was 42 days, this number masked the reality that veteran yards routinely finished vessels in under 3 weeks. Meanwhile, new shipyards built solely for the emergency program were coming online across the country. The Maritime Commission had effectively created an entire industry from scratch. The scale of American industrial output became painfully clear to the U-boat fleet during the fierce convoy battles of March 1943. Two convoys, HX-229 and SC-122, traveling close enough to be targeted together, were attacked by nearly 40 submarines in what became the largest wolf-pack action of the war. The U-boats succeeded in sinking 22 merchant ships, a result celebrated by Admiral Dönitz as evidence that the submarine arm remained decisive. Yet the sense of triumph evaporated almost immediately. Within days, intelligence officers reported that during the exact week of the Wolfpack assault, American yards had launched 38 new ships. The arithmetic was brutal. Each loss inflicted on Allied convoys was being offset and surpassed almost instantly by new construction. U-boat veteran Korvettenkapitan Wolfgang Luth, credited with sinking 47 ships, articulated the growing sense of futility in a letter to his wife that survived the war. He confessed that the targets assigned to U-boat crews no longer aligned with reality. The Allies had produced more than 1 million tons of shipping in the previous month alone. We are no longer fighting a fleet, we are fighting a factory. The data confirmed the growing despair. After the United States entered the conflict in December 1941, Germany's tonnage target effectively doubled to roughly 700,000 gross registered tons per month. This target was met only once in November 1942, and by mid-1943, average sinkings had fallen to less than 1/10 of the required rate. The hunters were now being pursued, and the calculations that had once guided the tonnage war had turned decisively against them. Already weakened by mounting losses, U-boat morale began to collapse. Sailors began referring to their vessels as iron coffins, a phrase that would have been severely punished only a year earlier, but by 1943 had become so commonplace that officers largely ignored it. Confronted with the undeniable reality of American industrial dominance, Dönitz attempted urgent measures to sustain the tonnage campaign. In a meeting with Hitler on May 31, 1943, he argued for a dramatic increase in submarine production, requesting a minimum of 40 new boats per month. Hitler, increasingly detached from operational realities, approved the plan, but allocated no additional resources to make it feasible. Dönitz also issued tactical adjustments. U-boats were instructed to target fully laden ships over empty ones, prioritize tankers over general cargo vessels, and focus on newly constructed vessels that would be difficult to replace. Despite these changes, they were largely irrelevant against the overwhelming pace of American shipbuilding. In his diary entry from June 1943, Dönitz wrote with unusual emotion, "The enemy's production figures have been confirmed from multiple sources. We face not just a fleet, but an entire industrial apparatus. Each patrol now costs us boats we cannot replace, while new enemy vessels are launched daily. The arithmetic of the tonnage war has become our death sentence." At the core of America's success was industrialist Henry J. Kaiser, who had never built a ship prior to 1940. Drawing on experience from massive projects like the Hoover Dam, Kaiser introduced methods that would fundamentally transform ship construction. German intelligence meticulously studied his techniques, trying to understand how one man's approach could so decisively influence the Battle of the Atlantic. Kaiser's methods were deceptively simple yet revolutionary. He implemented modular construction and welding of prefabricated sections rather than relying on rivets, assembly line processes, round-the-clock shifts, and a workforce that included thousands of women turned shipyards into efficient factories. German naval architects who examined captured documents were astonished. At its peak, Kaiser's Richmond yard employed roughly 90,000 workers. Prefabrication allowed multiple ships to progress simultaneously,
While one hull was being assembled, components for several others were already under construction, moving through a system reminiscent of an automobile factory. Rear Admiral Werner Fuchs, head of German naval construction, reported to Donitz, "Kaiser has mechanized shipbuilding in a way we never imagined. Our yards resemble artisan workshops. Theirs function as factories. We build ships, they manufacture them. The difference is not simply in scale, it is in kind."
The Liberty ship became the most visible symbol of American industrial power, haunting U-boat crews. Based on a simple British design dating back to 1879, these vessels were intentionally plain, slow, and unremarkable, but capable of carrying up to 10,000 tons of cargo. A single Liberty ship could transport thousands of jeeps, hundreds of tanks, or hundreds of millions of rounds of ammunition. What unnerved German planners was not their sophistication, but their sheer quantity and replaceability. When U-515 under Werner Henke sank the Liberty ship Thomas McKean in June 1942, American yards launched 3 identical vessels within the same week. The loss of one ship had no strategic impact. It was the production system itself that mattered. Captured German officers were frequently shown films depicting Liberty ship construction. In one time-lapse film showing an entire hull assembled in seemingly minutes, even veteran U-boat officers were left speechless. Kapitänleutnant Hans Jennis later recalled, "It appeared as though an entire ship was built in moments. It was propaganda, yes, but the ships themselves were real. We saw them constantly through our periscopes. New paint, new flags, heading toward Britain." American mass production provided advantages far beyond numerical superiority. It altered the psychological and strategic dynamics of the Atlantic War, undermining German confidence while reinforcing Allied momentum. Ultimately, the struggle was not just against steel and tonnage, but against an industrial system capable of replacing losses many times over, a reality that U-boat crews could neither fight nor escape. The introduction of standardized parts revolutionized naval logistics, making it possible to interchange components across hundreds of vessels. Any damaged Liberty ship could be repaired at an Allied port using these uniform components, significantly reducing downtime. In contrast, German submarines and ships were often custom-designed or extensively modified, requiring specialized parts that could take months to produce, delaying repairs and limiting operational flexibility. This system of standardization also accelerated technological adaptation. By late 1943, when the Allies began countering acoustic torpedoes effectively, hundreds of Liberty ships were retrofitted with noise mitigation devices in just a few weeks. Meanwhile, German efforts to adapt their fleet to Allied radar took years to implement across the smaller, more individualized U-boat fleet. Heinz Schaefer, who later commanded U-977 on its famed surrender voyage to Argentina, noted the stark contrast. Americans applied lessons learned from each sinking across hundreds of ships almost immediately. We learned as well, but our improvements were painstakingly applied to individual submarines. They waged an industrial war. We fought a craft-based one. By the fall of 1943, it had become clear that the balance of production heavily favored the Allies. Intelligence reports indicated that American shipyards were producing more than 1.5 million tons of shipping per month. By September 1942, the combined output of the United States and Canada had already surpassed losses. 713,240 tons of merchant shipping were completed, while 500,881 tons were lost to enemy action. The gap continued to grow, making it increasingly difficult for German forces to slow the Allies' logistical expansion.
At an October 1943 conference of U-boat flotilla commanders, Officer Donat presented figures that confirmed the grim reality. On a blackboard, he listed the month's losses and gains. 29 vessels totaling 156,000 tons were sunk, while 140 new ships amounting to 1,200,000 tons were completed. This left the Allies with a net gain of 111 ships and 1,044,000 tons. Silence fell over the room until Corvetan Captain Vera Vinta, leader of the first flotilla, remarked, "Even if we fail to sink any vessels, the enemy's strength continues to grow. Our attacks do nothing but give their shipyards practice." Dunit's response, recorded by his aide, reflected the ethos driving the U-boat campaign. "Gentlemen, we persist not because we can win the tonnage war, but because our duty requires it. Every ship we sink, even temporarily, delays resources reaching the enemy. We may have lost the numerical battle, but our honor remains intact." For the ordinary U-boat sailors, the overwhelming scale of American production was gradually understood through daily experience rather than official statistics. Wilhelm Hoffmann, a torpedo mechanic aboard U-604, maintained a private journal documenting this slow recognition. March 1942. Sank an old Greek steamer, barely held together by paint. These are the vessels starving England. September 1942. Encountered a modern American freighter in convoy. Fresh paint, sleek lines. Where did it come from? March 1943. Every convoy vessel appears newly built, identical profiles as if pressed from the same mold. July 1943. Overboatsman reports Americans construct 3 ships for every 1 we sink. If true, what is the point of our patrols?
October 1943 spotted 17 ships in convoy, all flying American flags, all newly built. Only one was damaged. What purpose does this serve? The Germans' attempts to gauge and counter the American shipbuilding machine evolved into a sophisticated intelligence campaign. Agents in neutral nations purchased U.S. newspapers and technical journals, often smuggling them through Spain and Sweden. Captured merchant seamen were interrogated rigorously about shipyard locations, construction methods, and output rates. These efforts revealed an even more formidable picture. Beyond Liberty ships, the Allies were producing Victory ships, faster, larger, and more advanced vessels, further ensuring that Allied shipping would outpace German attempts to disrupt it. During World War II, American logistics relied heavily on specialized vessels. Among them were T-2 tankers, each capable of transporting approximately 141,000 barrels of oil, and C-series cargo ships, C-1, C-2, and C-3, designed to optimize performance along specific trade routes and handle particular types of cargo. To protect these vital supply lines, the Allies also deployed hundreds of escort carriers and destroyer escorts. In December 1943, Naval Intelligence Officer Ernst Kleur compiled an extensive report on American shipbuilding capabilities. His conclusions were striking. The United States was producing ships at a rate that far surpassed all pre-war predictions of its industrial output. In Kleur's assessment, American shipyards were constructing more vessels annually than the entire pre-war global merchant fleet combined. Even before the U.S. entered the war, German submarine commanders recognized the overwhelming potential of American industry. Captured officers' testimonies, preserved in Allied interrogation records, offer a window into the psychological evolution of Germany's naval leadership, from early confidence through mounting skepticism to ultimate despair. Fritz Julius, LMP, who commanded U-30 at the outbreak of hostilities, reflected in 1940 that a small flotilla of 20 U-boats might strangle Britain. By 1943, despite Germany operating 200 submarines, the situation in the Atlantic had deteriorated severely. He noted that the Americans had not destroyed their submarines directly. Instead, the sheer scale of Allied ship production overwhelmed them. Another officer, Lieutenant Heinrich Müller-Edzards, captured following the sinking of U-590 in July 1943, provided more precise observations. He recounted attending a briefing on U.S. production figures, during which the presenting officer apologized, acknowledging the numbers seemed almost impossible, yet they had been verified by multiple sources.
Each time Edzards raised his periscope to scan a new convoy, he was confronted with the reality.
The cumulative figures from the tonnage war illustrated Germany's strategic defeat. By the conflict's end, the U-boat arm had sunk around 6,000 vessels, totaling 21 million gross register tons. Meanwhile, Allied shipyards had produced over 38 million tons of new shipping. This net gain of 17 million tons meant that by war's conclusion, the Allies possessed a merchant fleet larger than at the beginning of hostilities. For Admiral Karl Dönitz and his staff, these numbers represented not just a tactical loss, but a fundamental misjudgment of wartime economics. The tonnage war had been premised on the assumption of finite production capacity, yet it had not accounted for an adversary capable of mobilizing an entire industrial base into continuous ship construction. In his final wartime diary entry, Dönitz noted, "We waged the previous war with weapons intended for an earlier era. The Americans fought with factories. In the end, it was the Liberty ships, not our submarines, that determined victory. They were not superior vessels, but they were unending in number. We sank ships, they replaced them with fleets." During his imprisonment at Mondorf-les-Bains in August 1945, Dönitz engaged in extensive discussions with fellow captured leaders. In one recorded conversation with Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, he admitted that by spring 1943, he recognized the tonnage war was effectively lost. Calculations by his staff suggested that at Germany's maximum production capacity, building 2,700 cargo ships would require 150 years. The United States achieved this in just 4 years, while simultaneously expanding the largest naval and air forces in the world. Keitel asked why Dönitz continued to send U-boats on increasingly perilous missions. His response revealed the strategic trap they had created. Ceasing operations would have been an acknowledgement that Germany's naval strategy was fundamentally flawed. Continuing the campaign, although futile, allowed them to maintain a semblance of purpose against an overwhelming industrial adversary. Ironically, American shipbuilders were largely unaware of the psychological effect their labor had on the enemy. Workers at Kaiser shipyards expressed astonishment after the war upon learning how demoralizing their efforts had been for German submariners. Rosie Thompson, a welder at Richmond Shipyard No. 2, recalled, "We were simply trying to beat the previous shift's production record. Sometimes we painted slogans on the ships, messages from America's women, or notes from Richmond to Hitler, but we never imagined how much it would affect the other side." During World War II, few realized the psychological blow inflicted on German submarine commanders simply by observing American shipyards from their periscopes. Even Henry Kaiser, in a 1946 interview, confessed that he had not fully appreciated the far-reaching consequences of the production strategies he had implemented. He reflected, "I was focused on efficiency, costs per ton, and worker safety. It wasn't until after the conflict ended that I realized we had, in effect, automated victory."
The scale of American industrial output was simply beyond the capacity of Germany's calculations. No German strategy could match the production mathematics that drove the Allied war effort. Each Liberty ship represented not just a cargo vessel, but a tangible demonstration that a democratic economy could outbuild totalitarian control. The statistics themselves illustrate the story with stark clarity. Germany commissioned 1,162 submarines, but lost 777 of them, resulting in roughly 30,000 submarine crew fatalities, a casualty rate of approximately 75%. Allied shipping losses totaled 2,779 vessels. Meanwhile, American shipyards produced 2,710 Liberty ships, 534 Victory ships, and over 500 additional cargo ships, bringing total production to more than 5,000 vessels. At the height of this output, U.S. shipyards were capable of constructing the entire pre-war commercial fleet in just 3 years. Donitz's careful wartime calculations from 1939 were not merely countered, they were obliterated by the sheer scale of American industry. Post-war interviews with surviving German commanders revealed how profoundly the industrial realities had impacted their perception of the conflict. By mid-1943, many admitted they understood the war was effectively lost, not through battlefield defeats, but by examining production statistics. Corvette Captain Adelbert Schnee, among the most decorated U-boat officers, recounted at a 1975 veterans gathering. "We excelled as fighters, yet were overcome by accountants and factory workers. The cost of every torpedo we launched exceeded the price of constructing 5 American homes. Liberty ships, by contrast, cost less than a single one of our torpedoes. We had been engaged in the wrong type of combat, wielding inadequate weapons against an adversary whose strength we underestimated." The realization of American capabilities continued to resonate long after the war ended. Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock, the famed commander of U-96 depicted in Das Boot, later transitioned to civilian shipping. Even into the 1960s, he observed Liberty ships still performing efficiently. He remarked, "We were told these ships were disposable, barely seaworthy, yet they outlasted our most advanced submarines by decades. It was a bitter irony. These so-called throwaway ships surpassed our best technology." In February 1943, a striking document circulated among U-boat fleet commanders. Authored anonymously at the time, it was later attributed to Corvette Captain Hans Rudolf Rossing. The report provided a precise mathematical assessment of the war at sea.
U.S. monthly production, 1 million tons and rising. Allied shipping losses, 400,000 tons and declining. Net gain for the Allies, 600,000 tons per month. Projections indicated that by December 1943, all shipping losses since 1939 would have been fully replaced. By the end of 1944, Allied merchant tonnage would surpass pre-war levels by 100%. And by December 1945, their fleet would amount to double the world's 1939 commercial capacity. The conclusion was clear. The tonnage war was not merely slipping away from Germany, it was already lost. Though Donitz's headquarters suppressed the document, surviving copies confirmed its alarming accuracy. Subsequent Allied production even exceeded these forecasts. U-boat commander Peter Kretschmer, known as Ollie and leader of U-333, reflected on the realization with remarkable clarity in his post-war memoir. America had been portrayed to us as a nation of entertainers and dreamers, incapable of meaningful warfare. Then we observed them producing ships faster than we could count, let alone sink. Each Liberty ship represented a massive, tangible contradiction to our assumptions. I remember precisely when the truth hit me, March 1943. From that moment, the outcome of the war was undeniable. The evidence from both statistical records and personal testimony underscores an unambiguous conclusion. The industrial power of the United States, fueled by organization, innovation, and sheer manpower, decisively outstripped German naval strategy. The victory of Allied forces was, in large measure, engineered not only on battlefields and oceans, but in factories and shipyards, where mathematics, logistics, and production efficiency became the ultimate instruments of war. After sinking a single freighter, a precise operation executed without incident, my watch officer urgently summoned me to the periscope. On the distant horizon, another convoy appeared. 40 vessels, freshly built in American shipyards, all en route to Britain.
At that moment, I had only 2 torpedoes remaining. 2 weapons against 40 ships. Mathematically, we were doomed. We were members of the U-boat force, highly trained submariners who prided themselves on bravery and tactical skill. Yet in the cold arithmetic of industrial warfare, courage was insufficient. One cannot destroy a production system with valor alone. An assembly line cannot be defeated with heroism. The United States had transformed its industrial capacity into a weapon, and we were sent to hunt its output with submarines. Attacking their shipping was akin to attempting to slash a storm with a blade, noble in intent, but ultimately powerless. During the Nuremberg trials, Admiral Karl Dönitz faced intensive questioning regarding his persistence in continuing the U-boat campaign despite clear evidence of American industrial superiority. His testimony offers one of the most candid insights into the realities of the conflict. By early 1943, intelligence reports indicated that American shipyards were producing roughly 140 ships per month, whereas our U-boats were sinking fewer than 40 in the same period. The ratio, 3-to-1, demonstrated that we were steadily losing the tonnage war, a disparity that widened with every passing month. Yet the choice was stark: abandon the Atlantic without resistance, or attempt to impede the Allied supply chain at tremendous risk. The German Navy persisted not out of expectation of victory, but to compel the Allies to allocate resources to convoy protection, to construct ever more vessels, and to maintain an extensive anti-submarine infrastructure. The strategic goal was not triumph in the traditional sense, but the imposition of costs on the enemy. The tragedy lies not in the eventual defeat in the tonnage war, a foregone conclusion once the United States joined the conflict, but in the initial belief that it was winnable. Germany had challenged the preeminent industrial power in the world to a contest of output. The outcome was determined before the first torpedo was fired.
By the end of hostilities, the scale of American production astonished even experienced U-boat officers. In a prisoner of war camp in Louisiana, captured German submariners were shown a film detailing American shipbuilding. The documentary asserted that at peak capacity, the United States could recreate the entire pre-war commercial fleet in only 3 years. Captain Johann Moore, present with 30 fellow officers, dismissed the presentation as propaganda, an impossibility, he insisted. The American camp commander responded by arranging an on-site inspection at the Houston Ship Channel. There, the Germans witnessed dozens of Liberty ships under construction, a massive workforce welding, assembling, and launching ships with daily consistency. Moore later recounted, "We observed more tonnage being created in a single morning than our finest patrols had destroyed in months. Some of us cried, others laughed, a bitter laughter, born of belated comprehension. For years, we had attempted to empty the ocean while the Americans refilled it with relentless efficiency." The recognition of American industrial dominance marked a fundamental turning point in warfare. The conflict was no longer determined solely by tactical skill or individual heroism. Production capacity had become decisive. In a 1960 interview, the late Captain Reinhard Churn, former commander of U-564, reflected on this harsh lesson. Modern war favored the output of shipyards over the proficiency of submariners. The United States did not defeat the U-boat fleet through superior vessels or tactics. They prevailed through superior mathematics. War had become an equation, and the Americans simply produced more solutions than Germany could counter with problems. The psychological trajectory of German submariners, from confidence through disbelief to despair, mirrored the broader experience of the German military. Trained for tactical engagements at sea, they confronted industrialized warfare on an unprecedented scale. Submariners who had prepared to combat ships instead found themselves facing factories. Even decades later, the scale and efficiency of American production continued to overwhelm German naval veterans, a stark reminder that in modern conflicts, the conveyor belt can triumph over courage, and welding torches can outmatch valor.
At the 1985 gathering of former U-boat veterans in Kiel, the keynote address was delivered by Eric Topp, a retired Corvettenkapitän. Addressing the audience of surviving submariners, he reflected on their unique place in history. "We were part of the most formidable submarine fleet ever assembled. Our training was meticulous, our vessels state-of-the-art, and our operational methods groundbreaking. We inflicted severe damage to Allied shipping, coming perilously close to crippling Britain. Yet, despite our prowess, we faced an adversary unlike any we had encountered, one whose strength was not in superior submarines or tactical ingenuity, but in the ability to mobilize an entire society into an instrument of war." Topp emphasized that victory for the Americans was not achieved merely at sea. Every citizen, housewives purchasing war bonds, young men and women laboring in shipyards, and farmers supplying food to the workforce, was effectively a weapon. We could sink their convoys, only to witness more ships take their place. The battle was not fought in waves, but in an unstoppable cascade of production.
He called for a remembrance of fallen comrades with honesty rather than false pride. We were warriors shaped by the traditions of an earlier era, contending with a foe that had invented a new paradigm of warfare. Our defeat did not come at the hands of a superior naval force, but through Liberty ships, clunky, slow, mass-produced vessels that symbolized a democracy capable of converting its entire society into an arsenal. The lesson, Topp insisted, was clear. In modern warfare, the industrial front can outweigh the combat front. Shipbuilding, factory output, and production capacity became as decisive as the tactical skill of those on the battlefield. Through periscopes and intelligence reports, German submariners observed seemingly endless lines of American vessels emerging from shipyards, advancing relentlessly toward horizons they could no longer threaten effectively. By the end of the war, the numbers confirmed what U-boat commanders had understood intuitively years earlier. After the United States entered the conflict, Germany needed to sink roughly 700,000 tons of shipping each month to secure a tonnage victory. But this goal was met only once, in November 1942. In contrast, American shipyards were producing over 1.5 million tons monthly by 1943, overwhelming German calculations. The human cost of this mathematical disadvantage was catastrophic. Out of 40,000 men who served in the U-boat force, approximately 30,000 perished, representing a staggering 75% casualty rate, the highest among any military branch in any nation during World War II. Their extraordinary courage and skill were rendered largely irrelevant by an unmatchable industrial output. Admiral Karl Donitz, reflecting years later in his memoirs, summarized the crux of the tonnage war. "We calculated the tonnage needed to force Britain's capitulation. What we never envisioned was that America could produce 2 million tons of shipping per month. It was not a miscalculation, but a failure to imagine such industrial capacity. By the time we recognized it, through periscope sightings and intelligence reports, the war was effectively over. Yet we fought on for 2 more years before confronting the reality." Of the 2,710 Liberty ships constructed between 1941 and 1945, only 2 remain operational today, the SS John W. Brown and the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, preserved as memorials. These vessels stand not as feats of naval design, but as testaments to industrial achievement and to the nation that Franklin Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. For German submariners, each Liberty ship represented something profoundly different, a tangible, unassailable proof of defeat. Every rivet and ton of cargo capacity was a figure in an equation they could not balance. They had entered the war confident in the superiority of German engineering, the excellence of their crews, and the inevitability of victory, only to discover that success could be manufactured in factories far from the ocean. This realization that shipyards could decisively outmatch submarines marked a turning point in the nature of warfare. Industrial capacity had become more decisive than maritime skill, the assembly line more impactful than the front line. Ultimately, the U-boat fleet's downfall was not caused by better Allied ships, superior tactics, or even courage. Their defeat came through 2,710 Liberty ships, built relentlessly over 4 years, each weighing 7,000 tons, a numerical victory as undeniable as it was mundane. In the modern era, Top explained, victory favors the productive over the daring, the systematic over the individually skilled, and the builders over the destroyers. The surviving commanders carried this knowledge with them long after the conflict ended. They had fought brilliantly with submarines, only to learn too late that the enemy's strength was measured not in firepower, but in output, not in audacity, but in the capacity to construct. Their experience remains a cautionary tale. In industrialized warfare, courage and skill, while admirable, cannot compete with overwhelming production capability. The U-boat submariners were among the most skilled and valiant warriors in history, yet even their exceptional training and bravery could not offset a society capable of transforming steel and labor into strategic advantage. The tonnage war ultimately demonstrated that modern conflict is won not by the mastery of destruction, but by the mastery of creation, and that the ability to produce faster than one's adversary has become the ultimate determinant of victory.